Well, as usual, I'm very happy to welcome all of you who are here, and good evening, Jerusalem. It's 9 o'clock in the evening there, and I have an audience there too. Well, we're going to be talking today about the book of Judges, which is a compilation of stories about so-called judges. They really aren't judges. They're chieftains, warlike figures who respond to an emergency and lead the Israelites temporarily until the emergency is over. And we'll be talking about a number of these judges, and some of them are very unusual characters. But the real meaning of judges is something that's very reminiscent of the history of the United States. What happened was, as we read in Deuteronomy and then in Joshua, that a group of people called the Israelites had immigrated into the land of Canaan. And in Joshua, we read about how they settled. You recall the main thrust of the book of Joshua was, it's probably not as the Bible describes it in the first 12 chapters of Joshua. Namely, it was not a military conquest, but a merging of immigrants into the Canaanite population of the land of Palestine, or Israel. What's the story of the United States? The story of the United States is that a significant number of immigrants crossed the Atlantic Ocean and settled in America. They didn't conquer America, but they merged into the country, settled down, and interestingly enough, there were 13 tribes that came to settle America, only they were called colonies. The Israelites were 12 tribes, so it's about the same number. In the 18th century, when they came to America, they were fleeing from some degree of oppression in Europe to find here a new life. The Israelites were fleeing from some degree of oppression in Egypt in order to find a new life. In America, That new life turned out to be the United States of America. In Palestine, what was the new life consisted of? Well, in the book of Judges, we find out that it consisted of a very loose confederacy of 12 tribes. Each tribe settled in its own area. There was no central government. Every tribe conducted its own affairs individually. And as we read in the book of Judges, they were surrounded by enemies. And every time an enemy attacked, they always attack one particular area, one particular tribe or two tribes. They were not strong enough to defend themselves as a small tribe. So what did they do? Well, in the book of Judges, we find out that they send out an SOS to all the other tribes. Help. We need support. We can't do it by ourselves. Then every tribe had the option of saying yes or no. You never had all of the other tribes saying yes. Every tribe had its own problems and had its own needs. But 3, 4, 5, whatever number responded with assistance. And they were led by the judges. Not a very satisfactory situation. So we find in the book of Joshua one refrain all through the book. We need a king. If we don't have a king ruling all of the other tribes, we're lost. We can't defend ourselves as individual tribes. And it took quite a long time before that was accomplished, because we're going to be reading and talking further about the book of Kings. But in the time of the book of Judges, there were no kings, there was no unified country, and there was constant fear. What happened in the United States when the 13 colonies came into being? Well, even they had concerns because other countries in Europe had interests in the New World, particularly France. If we had remained a loose confederacy of 13 states or 13 colonies, what would have happened to the United States of America? The big difference between the United States and ancient Palestine that led to different results was what? What? Exactly. These 13 colonies or states had the wisdom to establish a constitutional convention and write a constitution which outlined a method by which all states would automatically be united, and we became the United States of America. That did not happen in Palestine. What happened in Palestine was much more understandable. At that time in history, there was only one way of having a united country, and that was to have a king. For literally thousands of years, countries all over the world were ruled by a monarch, whatever you call him, a king, an emperor, whatever title. But the idea that we developed so uniquely and so remarkably in America was to be able to put together a kind of a unified government of states. And we were able to develop a system where states could make up their laws, state laws, and all of the states would participate in a United States with federal laws governing everyone. That form of government was certainly remarkable in its time and still hasn't been completely resolved. We still have problems. Sometimes federal government wants to take on powers that individual states resist, and the reverse. That's still happening. But we've survived this long with that form of government.
Rabbi, would you agree that it's still...
What?
Would you agree that it is still the best system compared to any other place in the world?
I would certainly agree to that.
Okay.
But I want to point out that when they wanted a king in those days, that was their only alternative to the loose confederacy. Today, what we have in the world is a similar but larger problems. What we have in the world today is the problem of nations joining forces for the benefit of the entire world. The first time that happened was when we created the League of Nations. And now we have the United Nations. We even have talk today in some corners of our country. Why do we need a United Nations? We can take care of our business ourselves. So I mention all this for us to understand the book of Judges. The book of Judges is a fascinating introduction to the concept that individual states or individual nations face a tremendous challenge in seeking the best for all rather than the best for ourselves. The whole notion of America first is a dismissal of the idea of what's best for all mankind. In the book of Judges, we see what happens when you don't have a government that is concerned with the entire nation rather than with a portion of that nation. There are a number of judges in the book of Judges, and we're going to talk now about some of them. But I want to end my introduction by asking you to bear in mind all the time that throughout the book of Judges, there is a constant awareness that this is not the answer. We need something more than having occasional heroes arise and solve the most immediate problem. One other interesting point that I want to make before getting into the judges themselves is this. There's an interesting note in chapter 3 of the book of Judges. Chapter 3, verse 1. These are the nations that God let remain to test Israel through them. And then he goes on to list the various nations at that time who threatened the survival of Israel. Again, it's very similar to modern times. Practically every one of these judges fought against a different nation. There were the Canaanites. They were the Edomites. There were the Ammonites. There were the Amorites, as well as nations like Egypt and Moab, Ammon, when I recite this list of names, I can do this in modern times. Israel has all kinds of nations to deal with. There's Egypt, there's Jordan, there's Iraq, there's Saudi Arabia. There was Jordan. All of the Arab nations. The line in chapter 3 that I read just now contains this notion. And it's a question, it involves a question that I continue to be asked, a question that so many of you, if not all of you, has not entertained. The question, why is there so much anti-Semitism in the world? We're asking that question a great deal these days. After the Holocaust, after all of that has occurred, the Nazi period and so on, why is it that to this day we have to have at Neveh Shalom and synagogues all over the country all of a sudden security guards that we haven't had for God knows how long? Why? You know, they ask me that question as though I know an answer. But this verse that I wanted to call to your attention is something for us to think about. From the biblical point of view. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. We talked about this when we spoke about the earlier parts of the Bible. The famous story of the binding of Isaac. Why would God command Abraham, who was the first monotheist, why would he tell him to kill his son, to sacrifice Isaac? Why would he do that? How can you tell a father to perform an act like that? Well, the answer is well known. Tell me. Exactly. That's just what we read. In other words, a biblical view, and I'm not telling you that's my view or you should have this view, is that anti-Semitism is a test. We find out for ourselves what it means to be a Jew when we have to face and deal with anti-Semitism. Now, that's a huge topic that I'm not going to be dealing with this lecture today. But it's interesting that very early on in our history, really when the first time the Jews had to face hatred because they're Jews, the suggestion here is God is testing them. How are they going to react? Well, in the book of Judges, they reacted by fighting back as much as they could. And the leaders were the judges. An interesting group of people. The first judge was a man whose name you probably aren't familiar with, except that someone living today has adopted that name. And that name is Ehud. He was the first judge. Who am I talking about today? Some of you heard him not long ago. Exactly. Now, Ehud is not a common Jewish name, not even a common biblical name. When we talk about biblical names that people have, it's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joshua, David, and so on. But Ehud Barak, the great general, born in Israel, raised in Israel, was given a name that is very significant to everyone living in Israel. Remember I said to you last week when we talked about the book of Joshua that in my mind, Israelis resonate much more with the book of Joshua than all the other books of the Bible. Because the book of Joshua deals with the conquest of Israel, the establishment of Israel as the home of the Jewish people. Well, a name like Ehud, who is the first fighter for Israel against an enemy of Israel, was a name that was picked up and used and highly admired in Israel. Okay, Ehud. The next one is Deborah. Deborah. Interesting stories about Deborah. She is the only one of all of the Shoftim in this book of Judges who really was a judge. When the book of Judges deals with Deborah, they distinctly say that she would be sitting as a judge, listening to cases and resolving them. It was kind of a surprise to me that Deborah should be included in the book of Judges. She's so unlike all of the others. So, why was she included as one of the judges? Because she teamed up with someone who really was, in the classical sense, a judge. And that also happens to be a name that's still widely used in the Jewish world, that's not associated with the Bible at all. And that's the name of Barak. You know what Barak means?
Lightning.
Lightning, exactly. And Barak is the general with whom Deborah allies herself in order to resist the new attacks against the land of Israel. In the book, or in the story of Deborah, there is included a story about a woman who really was, in the classical sense, a judge, namely a military figure. It's very unusual. And that was Yael, which also happens to be a very popular name in Israel. What she did was a sort of a concluding chapter in the battle of Deborah and Barak against the Canaanite ruler Sisera, the general Sisera. The Bible describes the battle that took place at the foot of Mount Tabor in Israel. And Barak defeated the army of Sisera. And then the story goes on that Sisera fled from the field of battle. He fled to the tent of Yael. And Yael gave him a cup, or more than one cup probably, of warm milk, and had him go to sleep and rest up after his battle. And then this gentle woman, Yael, cut off his head. And that was the coup de grace, the end of that war with Sisera. Now, that's the act of people like others that we are going to be talking about who were judges at that time. Well, let's just talk a little bit more about the judges. I want to discuss a little bit Gideon. That's in chapter 8. Gideon fought against another people, the Midianites, who were neighbors of Israel. The interesting thing about the story of Gideon is this. Again, they were attacked, and of course, in the Bible, in all such situations, God is involved, defending his people. God had an interesting personal problem to solve. Generally, this is a problem that God would have. If God would continue to save his people, they would never develop a sense of self-worth, of confidence in their own abilities. On the other hand, if he did not intervene and save his people, they were never able to do it by themselves. So he did something quite unique. He decided that he could have saved the Israelites from the Midianites and be at their side in their defense. But he decided that he was going to limit the army of Gideon to 300 people, 300 soldiers. Now, 300 soldiers are not a significant force when you're talking about thousands of soldiers on each side. So he tells Gideon, collect an army and fight against the Midianites, and I will be at your side and bring you victory. But you have to decide how to pick the 300 people that you want in your army. So this is just one of those interesting stories in the book of Judges. He gathered his entire army, consisting probably of 10,000 or so soldiers. And he brought them to the river. And he told them to drink from the water and watch them how they drank from the water. Well, there are two ways that you can drink from the water. One is to cup your hands in the water and bring up the water to your mouth and drink. Another way is to bow down to the water and lap the water with your tongue. These are soldiers. Most of them, almost all of them, did what soldiers would do. Cupped their hands and brought up water. 300 of them licked the water like dogs. The ones who were the least likely to be good soldiers But what a way to find out who they were. You know what you would do today? Today you would sit them down and fill out a long test. But this was a simple thing to do. So with that meager force, Gideon went out to fight against the Midianites and, of course, with God's help, defeated them. And then this is the only case in the book where you had all of these stories of the Shoftim, where the people said, Gideon, would you be our king? And he turned them down. Basically, he turned them down because he knew clearly it wasn't his leadership that brought them the victory, but it was God. And that one way or another, good old God would always come through. And he did not want the burdens of leadership. He went right back to his normal occupation as a farmer. There you already have some indication of how people so often resist making basic changes in their life. They would much rather adopt the attitude in life, we've made it thus far, we've gotten through. Let's not change. There's a tremendous reluctance. What I vividly remember reading during the Nazi period of one particular country, and that was Romania. There is recorded the rather dangerous visits of representatives of Israel to Romania long after the Nazi period began, right in the middle of the Holocaust. Romania was not subject to the kind of treatment as was given to Jews in Poland and to the north there, Lithuania and Poland and so on. And I read through the stories of these representatives to Romania who described how often they talked to groups of Jews there, urging them, pleading with them, get out while you can. Come to Israel while you can. Save yourselves. And the reaction uniformly was, we've made it thus far, we'll live through it. And of course, paid a very heavy price for that. In other words, what they point out in the book of Judges, and this story of Gideon happens during this, approximately 100 or so years, when they were subject to attacks from one country or another, from one army or another, and had to rely on pleading with other tribes to help them, that they still resisted the idea of fundamentally changing their system and adopt a king who would rule over the entire country and automatically join the armies of all the tribes. They still couldn't do it, especially with the response of a Gideon. Okay, let me mention, time flies. Let me mention Jephthah. Now, I've talked about Ehud and talked about Barak and so on. Unless I'm wrong, and I'm happy to hear anybody here who knows differently, I don't know of any Jew who calls himself or is called Jephthah. That's really a strange character. He's also called to lead the tribes in a time of battle. So Jephthah is fighting against the Ammonites. That's another people. And in beginning his war against the Ammonites, he makes a pledge that anyone who walks out of his house during that time, he would sacrifice to God. Now, what he had in mind was, as we know, people in those days in their homes sheltered small animals, sheep and goats and so on. And he figured that one of them would come out and he would make the sacrifice to God. But who walks out of his house? His daughter, his only child. And he made the pledge, and he's going to sacrifice his daughter. The reason I wanted to just mention this, because I wanted you to take a look what I think one of the most beautiful passages in the book, in chapter 11, verse 36. The daughter says to him, "My father, you have opened your mouth to God. Do to me according to what you have, to what has gone out of your mouth. Since God has wreaked vengeance for you against your enemies, against the children of Ammon." But she said to her father, "Let this thing be done for me. Let me be for 2 months, and I shall go and wail upon the mountains and weep over my virginity, I and my friends." And he said, "Jephthah, go." And he released her for 2 months. And she went with her friends and wept over her virginity upon the mountains. At the end of 2 months, she returned to her father. He came out with her. He carried out with her the vow that he had chosen, and she never knew a man. This became a practice in Israel. From year to year, the daughters of Israel would go to lament with the daughter of Jephthah, the Gibeonites, 4 days of the year. He had made a vow. He fulfilled it. Unfortunately, unlike the story of Abraham, there didn't appear a ram to take her place. And they mourned her for so many years. Now, the next one that I want to just mention briefly, because you all know so much about him, was Samson. Now, Samson is a popular name in the Jewish world. And the story of Samson is he was born with a prediction of an angel. And when he was born, he was dedicated as a Nazarite, which is the equivalent in those days of a super Jew. Well, he turns out to be anything but a super Jew. He goes and falls in love with a Philistine. He does all kinds of crazy things that we read about in the Bible. And eventually, he committed suicide by tearing down the temple of the Philistines and brings along with him many Philistines to death without having any real impact on the history. But he's really the last of the judges. But the last story I'm not going to be able to deal with today, but I will next week. That finally was the straw that breaks the camel's back. And we finally come to a decision that enough is enough, and we're going to have a king to solve the problems of the Jewish people. So we'll take that up with the story of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, and then we'll be dealing with the period of time of the great kings, particularly David and Solomon. But first, I want to just give you some time to ask a question or make a comment on this period. Okay, we're almost finished with the transition, and we're going to start a new life for the Jewish people next week. Thank you.